Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the forwards cheat sheet. What we have now is a landscape with unfortunately a lot of injuries, and Kunku has been suggested to have a couple months long injury, so that will actually completely impact the Chelsea forwards and the landscape. And Jesus is expectedly out for maybe 1 or 2 weeks more, even 3 weeks. We're not exactly sure of the picture, but Arteta pretty much intimated that he won't make it for that first game week 1. And that's sort of how I've interpreted it myself. As far as the actual forwards, though, if we start from the budget forwards, at 4.5, you have some other options as well. You could even have some Sheffield United, Nottingham Forest, 4.5 strikers. I don't really care about this position. We're not really looking for many players here to actually fill in useful minutes. I think Mubama was the only preseason performer that was interesting, just from the point of view of having someone who, with Skamaka maybe leaving, with Antonio maybe not getting consistent minutes this year, he could maybe become a hidden gem in time to come. But I don't think he right now appears as a great option. He's still one to consider. Archer probably just going to fill in the minutes from Watkins, but highly unlikely that Watkins gets subbed off early. As I said, you do have someone like Orsul from Sheffield United or Uijo from Nottingham Forest, but nothing too interesting for me, unfortunately. As far as the 5.0 options, this is where you finally get some nailed players. And the beauty of this position really is, if you're, let's say, concerned about the 4.5s, all you can really do is just go for someone like Adebayo, who we know should be playing early minutes for Luton Town. Now, Luton Town could change their sort of striker partnership. They could even change their formation, but from the last that we've really seen, it's a partnership of Adebayo and Morris. Adebayo being the player who's not actually on penalties anymore. He used to be in penalties in the past. But they have a blank as well. And ultimately, we don't expect too much from this Luton Town team in terms of the offensive picture. So it's really just about a 5.0 option giving you minutes. I don't really particularly like it. As far as 5.5, this is where you actually have some true value. And for me, João Pedro is like a double-edged sword, right? He is someone who we might not expect to have a lot of minutes, but when you compare and contrast to all the forward options available in this Brighton team, he's the only option that I would consider as a good one. We also know now that he's on penalties. This could change in the future with maybe someone like Mohamed Kudus coming into the team, but I highly doubt that his penalty-taking position will be under threat. The serious concern will just be the minutes that he'll get in the system. Some people will intonate that he has been the sort of star signing so far for Brighton, and he will get a lot of minutes, but I don't think that's enough to suggest, that this Brighton team won't rotate. They just simply have too much depth in too many positions. What I do like about João Pedro so far is, of course, when you're moving and translating from, let's say, a Watford team into this Brighton team, which effectively were the second best offense last season, that's a good sign to suggest that even with, let's say, 50 to 60 minutes of gameplay each game, João Pedro is actually a very good option at 5.5. That's sort of the strength of the Brighton pick here. And his position in template drops is such that I don't think you should expect him to be a starter each week, but he can be great in odd weeks. So let's say from game weeks 1 to 8, if you expect him to play game weeks 1, maybe 2 and 4, so maybe once every 2 weeks, then he could fit in your draft quite well. I would not have the full confidence at this point in time in saying that he will start every week within my own FPL team, and I actually have him in my draft. As far as Morris, he is someone who is sort of the opposite end of the picture, right? Where with João Pedro is a little bit of a minutes gamble. With Morris, you have a bit more certainty, where I would say he's going to be the starting striker for Luton Town, even if they formationally change certain things, and he is the penalty taker as well. So that's a huge plus. And in a sense, we do always have some strikers coming from the Championship that do shine in the Premier League, but I think early signs are that this Luton Town team are probably a little bit weaker than most teams, even in the bottom half. And that's my only concern really with someone like Morris at this point in time, even though his underlying stats are actually really good for the Championship. And also when you look prospectively towards the Premier League, some Championship strikers have translated incredibly well. Watkins and Bamford as good examples. As far as Cunha, he's actually someone who has actually been the penalty taker for this Wolves team, so that actually makes him look quite good. The issue with Wolves is that they have a really, really poor offensive run of fixtures to start, so eventually, maybe at a later point in the season, he could be a better pick, but for now, he's only a differential. At 6.0, I think this is where we get some more true value outside of João Pedro if you want to skirt away from João Pedro and the doubt of his minutes. So Wissa for me is someone who we can say could probably get 75 minutes per game. The biggest threat to his minutes is going to be someone like Kevin Schade. He could, of course, start to play right wing, potentially even center forward positions, which would, of course, interrupt Wissa's minutes. But it's highly likely with Tony suspended, and also Brentford not really bringing in another sort of attacker into this team, that Weiss is going to get a good run of minutes. The one thing I would say is that he's not the penalty taker for this team, and the underlying stats aren't particularly great. Conversion is actually very good. So that's the huge benefit that you're really getting from someone like Weiss, as someone who is going to be nailed for a top half offense, probably more towards the mid-table, if we're being honest. But that's the sort of strength of Wisa. Calvert-Lewin, for me, is a pure gamble as well. He's more of a gamble in the sense that if he actually was fully fit, I would actually highly consider making him a yellow option or even a green option. That's what Calvert-Lewin has shown us in the past, but unfortunately the past was 2 years ago. And that's a huge sort of change for Calvert-Lewin, where he has now since become effectively someone who can't even really sustain 3 to 4 minutes of full matchday football. So that is a concern. He has only featured in the preseason once for around 45 minutes. I really struggle to see that he's going to get good minutes in these early fixtures. It's ultimately going to be a long process for him to sort of rebuild fitness. And he's very similar to someone like Cunha, where you could look at him as a better option in the future. But Everton's fixtures, they're good around game week 7 and 8. Maybe we can reconsider him then and reconvene and see where Calvert-Lewin lands. But he's also an asterisk just simply because of how he's suffered with injuries and how he's been unable to actually sort of overcome them, if we're being honest. As far as Alvarez, he is a yellow pick. I had a bit of a struggle actually classifying him as a yellow or an orange pick, because I was quite surprised to see him actually start for the Community Shield. And I wouldn't say that, of course, the previous Man City game is always going to be iterative of what Man City will play going forwards, because, for example, we didn't really see in Stones in the midfield, that sort of formational structure there too. So things will change, but Alvarez getting some early minutes, even in a wing position, is quite nice. And I'm highly doubting, for example, that we're going to see, let's say, consistent Erling Haaland subs at around 62 minutes, 65 minutes, which was the case in the Community Shield. But this is a nice, healthy picture for Alvarez, where I think when you're looking at someone like Foden, who's considered a gamble at 7.5, I think Alvarez is potentially even a better gamble at this point in time, just given his pricing. So he's always a great overperformer too, just based on last season. Underlying stats are very good in terms of expected goals per 90 at this sort of position. So I do really like Alvarez as a pick, and if he gets good minutes, then he's going to be a good option this season. But the question is whether that's going to happen, and whether he's going to get more than, let's say, 2 out of 3 starts each match. I mean, it could even be lower than that, which is the concern here at the start of the season. So for now, I would cautiously say that Alvarez is going to be a yellow, but I'm not that set on sort of putting him into my draft structures, because at this point in time too, if you have the option to, let's say, go triple City, I'd still actually back the double defense setup, even though we have some concerns naturally with the defenders at times. Solanke is an option, really just a differential. The big pro here is that he's going to be a 90-plus minute player for this Bournemouth team. Not many strikers in this list actually sort of boast this sort of position in the team. And of course, as a penalty taker too, he's going to have some inherent value there. Bournemouth don't have any sort of interesting run of games to start with, where I would say it makes sense to start with Solanke. He's definitely one option to consider. The underlying stats aren't particularly good, so I would still sort of avoid him for now. Maybe when we find some random spot in the season to sort of find a plug, to find a hole where there's a gap for a 6.5 forward, he would be relevant. But for now, he's just an afterthought. At 7.0, we start to finally see some options where I would say these would be more the template options outside of João Pedro, from the sort of forward territory. And Jackson, of course, is that pick. I would say that there needs to be an asterisk on Jackson, because from what I'm getting and glancing from just someone like Fabrizio Romano, it's very clear that Chelsea are still negotiating for someone like Dusan Vlahovic in this Juventus team, but it also means in general that they're going for a forward within this market. And as a result, that's going to impact Jackson's minutes. Also, if you start the season with Jackson, this is the sort of landscape you're dealing with. 2 slightly tougher games in terms of Liverpool at home and then West Ham away. And then you actually have a great run of games. But maybe around this great run of games, you already have someone like Vlahovic coming into the team, already competing with Jackson in terms of minutes. And therefore, starting the season out with Jackson doesn't make too much sense. I'd probably actually start a little bit higher, and we'll talk about that when we look at Watkins as a player. But so far, Jackson has been incredibly impressive in the preseason. So I still think he's going to get good minutes to start, unless, let's say, Vlahovic and that sort of deal is done. But he's impressed so far. His diagonal runs in particular and his runs in behind have been great. Obviously, if you want to say Liverpool getting exposed with a high line, very common occurrence, that could be something that Jackson could benefit from. I don't mind the idea of going for Jackson, particularly if you're going for, let's say, a slightly lighter midfield, maybe even a 3-4-3 template. So this does make sense. At the same time, I would say just think about in the back of your head if you're concerned about, let's say, when Chelsea's fixtures start to come good, if they'll be able to bring it forward in time, and potentially you could just wait until the deadline to see what kind of news we get for Chelsea and how the landscape has changed. With Højlund being announced into the game, I expected him to be at 7.0, just given the fact that he doesn't have a consistent body of work in terms of the big European leagues. But yes, of course, he's impressed within some of the European fixtures that we've seen on the international stage. However, I would still say I'd be cautious about him, particularly from the minutes. At 7.0, yes, it's a nice price if he becomes a consistent starter for United, but he's not going to have penalties. He will probably have to rotate at times. We have seen iterations of this United team with Rashford up top, even Sancho up top as a false nine. So I'm not that into Højlund for now, but I think he will grow as a player, and maybe at one point in the season when he becomes nailed into the team, if he does, he will become a better pick. At 7.5, I feel like this territory is still one to skirt and avoid. I would much rather go with Jackson at this point in time, save a bit of money there. But at 7.5, you have a lot of these players with minutes gambles, right? Someone like Isak has to compete with Wilson. It's a bit odd that Wilson hasn't played that much in the preseason. I'm not exactly sure what is going on, whether he's dealing with a knock or something like that. But Isak, of course, has looked positive. However, Newcastle's running games are still very, very poor. And when we look at Gakpo and Darwin, I think they're basically completely different options. Because I would say Gakpo is someone who's completely nailed when you look at the minutes of Liverpool. But the issue is now you're finding that Jurgen Klopp is starting to put him more often than not in the midfield. And if he's a midfielder classified as a forward and not actually getting many good chances when it comes to, let's say, FPL points, right? Because if you look at the expected goals per 90, Gakpo sort of sticks out like a sore thumb, unfortunately, in this position, right? 0.38 XG per 90 is very, very poor when you classify him against these forwards. And even though he has good minutes, that's the concern, really. I don't really like him if he's a midfielder. You've already got some Liverpool midfielders who are probably going to be even more involved. I mean, I would, let's say, even compared to Szoboszlai, who I would classify as an avoid in the midfield, could be even slightly better than Gakpo. But that's sort of the landscape of Gakpo, unfortunately. And with Darwin, you're not now expecting him to not get starts because, I mean, last two preseason friendlies have actually left us with Luis Diaz and Jota starts respectively, with Gakpo as well playing the midfield. And Darwin is the odd one out right now. He's sort of the player who's looking to come in for around 30 minutes a game. And of course, that could be a huge benefit because when you look at Darwin, the one thing you can definitively say is that he is one of the better players within Europe in terms of actually getting himself into advanced positions. However, he doesn't really convert particularly well, and you can sort of see that with the goals assists per 90. What's interesting about Darwin, though, is he's such a creative player, and you've seen a lot of, for example, assists to Salah in the past as well, where it does sort of make up for his really poor finishing, but you can't really excuse the poor minutes that he has currently in this Liverpool structure. So I would say that Darwin is still an early avoid. If you really want to punt because the fixtures might be good, such as the Bournemouth game, I can understand it, but I wouldn't really support it. As far as the 8.0 picks, I think Watkins has now become the clear option, the clear defined option at 8.0 is just simply because of the Jesus injury. Otherwise, I think Jesus would have been more than template. I mean, he wasn't featuring in all my drafts except for my first draft, I think, where I went with Nkunku first. So we know where that's gone with the two of them. But Jesus is probably going to come back a little bit sooner than later. What's interesting, too, is that Arsenal's fixtures aren't particularly good after that sort of opening run of 3 games. So if, let's say, Jesus actually misses, the first 2 to 3 game weeks, I mean, he's not going to really be an option until later on in the season. I don't think he's going to become essential or anything like that because we're most likely going to be moving into either a Newcastle forward or a 3-4-3 template where you're fitting in both a Watkins and a Wilson, or maybe even just keeping Jackson within our teams at that time if he seems to be like that sort of default Chelsea striker and they haven't been able to secure another forward at that time. So this is the landscape of FPL, and I think when you're looking at game weeks 1 to 8, there are only a very few standout options. I'd say João Pedro, Jackson, Watkins, and then of course these 2 tried and trusted options in terms of Kane and Haaland. I still think it's very, very hard to create a consistent team that's a little bit more flexible to the way that I actually like to start the season with in terms of Kane and Haaland, or let's say Salah and Haaland when we talk about double premium setups. So I'm actually going to avoid Kane for now, even though the latest news about Kane has been quite positive. Yes, of course, he's been rumored to actually be close to joining Bayern Munich, but it seems like Tottenham have actually definitively sort of rejected the bid that Bayern Munich had actually sort of offered last Friday. So based on David Ornstein's reports, it does seem like Kane will start the season. And the only thing I would say is game weeks 3 and 4 are great weeks to captain Kane. 5, of course, is going to be one in isolation where you'd say you'd definitely captain Kane over Haaland. But that's the issue. If you're not captaining Kane consistently, his value as a pick isn't particularly great. The big plus, though, and the big change is, of course, moving away from Antonio Conte to Ange Postecoglou, a team that actually creates a lot of shots, potentially even higher XG, which is something that we need to sort of see, because I think the preseason games don't give you enough quality. Yes, Spurs were able to have 80% possession versus a certain amount of teams. They were able to crack at least 30 shots per game, I think, in 3 out of 5 of their preseason games. But that still doesn't really tell us much when it comes to translating that to the Premier League as well. So that is my only point of concern right now. I would say Kane is someone that I would probably not have in my draft, but I can understand people already being open to the idea of having Kane in their draft. The only thing I'd say is game weeks 1 and 2 aren't a particularly great starting point for him for me to really consider it. You have so many other players here like a Jackson who also has a game week 1 and 2 that are quite poor but are much cheaper, and you can be much more flexible because it could allow you to sort of punt in the midfield early on than, let's say, wait for Kane to activate in game week 3. So that's sort of my initial thoughts over the forwards. But that's going to be the forwards cheat sheet for now in terms of players that I'd really seriously consider. In terms of the forwards to avoid here, we have some players who clearly won't play a significant role in the Premier League this season. So players like Balogun and Tony. Tony is suspended until January. Balogun seemingly leaving outside of the Premier League, and we won't really get his, loan deal, even if he moves to another Premier League, done by game week 1. So we can't really adjust to that, and so I would not really start without triple Arsenal for that reason too. So Vinicius is someone who suffers from, unfortunately, Mitrovic still staying at Fulham. And on top of that, Raul Jimenez joining too. And Kedia, I just can't see him getting many minutes now that we're seeing Havertz at the 9 spot. So, of course, it was an opportune moment when Jesus was injured. But now that Nketiah is not even getting minutes in Community Shield, other than being a super sub, really, I can't really see him being beneficial. As far as Ferguson, for me, the biggest reason why he's an avoid is when you compare to someone like João Pedro, who's going to also deal with minutes and let's say rotation as well. Ferguson is someone who actually deals with Welbeck, doesn't have penalties, can't really see why he's going to be a good option. Yes, I understand the value of looking at, let's say, Ferguson as a young talent, but that doesn't really mean anything for FPL. As far as Martial, he's someone who just, I don't think he'll get too many minutes this season. We'll probably still see Rashford and Sancho ahead of him in the pecking order, even if you don't count Rasmus. And as far as Nkunku, unfortunately, just injured out for a few months. And that's sort of the list. I don't think there's too many controversies with the forwards position. As I said, it's quite a thin position because of the injuries. And there's a good justification to say maybe we can actually skip and avoid the forwards for a while, then reconsider them when Newcastle have better fixtures in game week 5 or when Aston Villa have better fixtures in game week 7. But I can also at the same time understand going for a more template position of just simply starting with Watkins. So that's sort of my thoughts and views on the forwards. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and please feel free to like and subscribe at the same time. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.